Hello everyone, Professor Quizluck here. I just wanted to make another video thinking about authoritarianism and giving a few examples of authoritarian regimes and what makes them non-democracies. So we can start out with just this understanding, this rethinking about what an authoritarian regime is. Remember, there's minimal political pluralism, very limited political pluralism, which means power is concentrated in the hands of one leader, a small group of people, maybe a small group of people related to that leader or in that same political party. So the big takeaway there is its power is concentrated in a very small group of people or into one person's hand, which means there is little to no political competition. There might be elections. At times in authoritarian regimes, remember, there are sometimes elections, but there is very limited to no political competition. Those elections might not matter. They might be rigged. They might just be there for show, to show the international community that, hey, we have elections, or for domestic audiences to give this perception of choice. But in many authoritarian regimes, the majority of elections, again, sometimes some elections in an authoritarian regime might matter, because they send a feedback mechanism to those in charge. But really, the most important positions, those that we would consider at the federal level, they don't really matter. No one's going to vote out Vladimir Putin tomorrow in a free and fair election. So there's little to no political competition. Dissent is, again, repressed. It's controlled through censorship, through intimidation, sometimes through violence. So dissent is very, very repressed, restricted. We see individual freedoms are restricted, heavy use of propaganda, control of information. So when we think about, okay, so the key characteristics of an authoritarian regime are this centralization of power, oftentimes control over media, control over the narrative of the state, those in charge control the narrative, or those close to the governing regime maybe control much of the media. That way they can control the narrative, can really spread state propaganda, which will shape public opinion. State propaganda saying how great the regime's doing, or creating a negative view of opposition groups, a negative view of democracy at times, a negative view of anyone that's not part of the regime. So authoritarians use the control of the media, use state propaganda. Again, elections not free and fair. Even if they are, even if elections occur, they're not free and fair. There's repression of civil society, independent groups, activists face pretty severe restrictions. We see crackdowns on civil society, crackdowns on protests, on unions of interest groups that the regime views as possibly a threat. And of course, we see violence. We see political violence. We see the security forces cracking down on civil society. So just a quick rehash there of what an authoritarian regime is. So then let's think about some examples. The big one that we encounter a lot in the literature and in our lives that we see in the news is Russia under Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin has controlled Russian politics since 2000. So really the face of Russia today. Opposition parties, independent media face constant harassment. There are multiple parties in Russia. Even the Communist Party still remains today. There are a wide variety of political parties across Russia, but the majority of them, or at least a significant portion of them, aren't necessarily opposition parties like we would think in a functioning democracy. They might have a different name. They might not be the political party of the ruling class, but they aren't this opposition party who's trying to win elections and change Russia through electoral means. Some political parties are really just rubber stamps of what the Putin regime wants. Independent media, that's been a strategy of the Putin regime to really clamp down and crack down on independent media over the past 25 years. And Russia's been pretty successful of eliminating independent media. This is true, and this is exceptionally true since the special military operation, the full-scale invasion that Russia conducted into Ukraine. The clamp down on the media has intensified since then. You used to be able to, say in 2020, still access a lot of Western media in Russia. You could use a VPN to try to get around a lot of restrictions. Since the full-scale invasion, the Russian authorities have really cracked down on a lot of these outside media sources, really further consolidating control over the narrative in Russia. And so maybe if you're in Moscow or St. Petersburg, you can still access, you can still try to use a VPN to access Western media. But if you're in the provinces, if you're far from Moscow or Petersburg, you're probably being exposed to state-controlled media much of the time. In Russia, the elections are neither free nor fair. There's widespread manipulation. If you go on YouTube, you can find videos of ballot boxes literally being stuffed. Like the comical election day workers putting ballots in ballot boxes to shape the election results. So of course elections aren't free, they're not fair. Even when opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny have tried to run, they have faced stiff resistance. The regime just stops them from being able to run. So we also see the use of courts, police, intelligence services to stifle dissent. You will see protests in Russia, so it's not like there are no protests in Russia, but protests that challenge the regime. So political protests that might put pressure on the regime to change their behavior, or maybe anti-Putin protests, those have faced a stiff resistance. Those have faced widespread arrests, the use of violence and repression. Other protests in a place like Russia over, again, to use the example of garbage trash collection, garbage dumps, people frustrated about government services not taking care of their trash. Those protests have actually been allowed and haven't faced a lot of repression. So the big takeaway there is then that challenges to the regime are unacceptable. Political protests that appear as a challenge to the regime are unacceptable. But you still see some protests. Another example we can think about is China under Xi Jinping, a one-party state. So whereas Russia, we have many political parties, even if the majority of them or a big piece of them aren't that important or don't really challenge authorities. China is considered a one-party state. Xi has consolidated power since coming to power in 2013. He's eliminated presidential term limits, really consolidated power. In China, there are no opposition parties. We know that there is extensive censorship, extensive surveillance, especially against minority groups. And we see that the Chinese authorities have had pretty heavy-handed repression of protest movements. This is particularly true in a place like Hong Kong, where protesters faced a lot of state repression. Interestingly, in China, we have seen some protests, and this comes to mind. What comes to mind is anti-COVID lockdown protests. Near the end of the lockdowns in China, we actually saw some pretty big protests that were actually quite successful at changing governmental policy, which is kind of surprising in an authoritarian regime. We see political protests against the regime, against the authorities, that were successful. So China had pretty strict COVID-19 lockdown policies, far stricter than here in the United States. And as the world was starting to reopen, as places in Western Europe and the US had gone back to quote normal, lockdowns had been lifted, restrictions had been lifted. In China, they still remained, but we started to see some pretty big, widespread anti-lockdown protests. And the government didn't react with widespread violence. And it actually seemingly led to the Chinese authorities lifting their lockdowns on COVID-19. So we can say, yes, in authoritarian regimes, protests are oftentimes met with violence, but that is not always true. In Russia, we see protests. In China, we saw protests. But what you would not see is people in Beijing coming out and protesting against the government and trying to sway public opinion that way. Those protests, if they occurred today, would probably be met with some sort of state repression, because that is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. So a third example we can use is Belarus, at times referred to, characterized as the last dictatorship of Europe, the last authoritarian regime of Europe, if we're excluding Russia, but this is just something that Belarus is sometimes characterized by. So under Alexander Lukashenko, he has ruled Belarus since 1994, so certainly he's been in power a while. Here in Belarus, we see elections are widely seen as fraudulent. Opposition leaders are oftentimes jailed, forced into exile, not allowed to run for political office. State-controlled media promotes regime legitimacy. Security forces crack down on protesters. Belarus is definitely a pretty hardline authoritarian regime. Minimal protests in Belarus. Minimal civil society opposition to the governing authorities. And this is why that many international observers label Belarus as Europe's last dictatorship. So we see three different authoritarian regimes, Belarus, China, and Russia, that all have some similar characteristics of an authoritarian regime, but different in their own way. China is a single-party state. Vladimir Putin has oftentimes not wanted to be a part of any political party, and says he is above party politics. And then in Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko has controlled since '94, so really no threat of elections in Belarus. Okay, so I just wanted to give a couple examples of authoritarian regimes, and we think about why they're authoritarian regimes. They have some similarities and some differences. Okay, thank you.